That night in 2016, it was around 2 a.m., and the store was dead quiet, quieter than usual, even for a graveyard shift. I was behind the counter, perched on a wobbly stool, flipping through a dog-eared paperback I'd found under the register. The pages were yellowed, curling at the edges, and the spine was cracked from too many bored cashiers before me. The hum of the coolers was my only company, a low drone that usually faded into the background. Outside, the world was still, wrapped in that heavy silence that settles over lonely highways in the early hours. Then came the sound, a faint tapping, sharp and distinct against the quiet. At first, I brushed it off as a branch brushing the glass. There'd been a light breeze all evening, rustling the pine trees that flanked the store, their needles whispering secrets to the night. But the tapping didn't stop. It kept going, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone rapping their knuckles against the window. 1, 2, 3, pause, then again. It wasn't random, it had purpose, and that's what made my skin prickle. I set the book down, its pages splaying open on the counter, and leaned forward to peer out. The front of the store was framed by these big plate glass windows, streaked with dust and smeared with the guts of moths that had met their end against the panes. Beyond them stretched the parking lot, empty except for a couple of faded white lines, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the sodium lights overhead. Their buzz was faint but constant, like a chorus of tired insects. And there he was, standing just outside the glass, a man. He was tall, lanky, his frame swallowed by a dark hoodie that hung loose over his shoulders. The hood shadowed his face, leaving it a void, a blank space where features should have been. His hands were pressed flat against the window, long fingers splayed out, and he was tapping, 1, 2, 3, over and over, a metronome of unease. My stomach twisted, a cold knot tightening in my gut. We didn't get many walk-ins that late, especially not on foot. The highway stretched for miles in both directions, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through nothing but woods, no houses, no gas stations, just trees and darkness. Who walks that stretch at 2 a.m.? I swallowed hard and called out, "Hey, we're open, come inside if you need something," trying to keep my voice steady, casual, like this was normal. It wasn't. He didn't move, didn't even tilt his head to acknowledge me. Just kept tapping, the sound drilling into my skull. My hand hovered over the phone by the register, fingers brushing the cracked plastic, ready to dial my manager, or the cops, if it came to that. I didn't want to overreact, but something about him felt wrong, like he wasn't there to buy a soda or a pack of smokes. The tapping grew louder in my mind, drowning out the coolers, the lights, everything. I stared at him, willing him to move, to do something human. Then, without warning, he stepped back, one fluid motion, and vanished into the darkness beyond the lot. I didn't see him leave. There was no sound of footsteps crunching gravel, no rustle of leaves as he slipped into the trees. He was just gone, swallowed by the night like he'd never been there at all. My breath caught, and I fumbled with the door lock, twisting it shut even though company policy screamed at us to keep it open 24/7. Screw policy, I wasn't taking chances. The rest of the shift dragged on, every creak of the building making me jump, every shadow outside the window stretching into something sinister. When dawn finally crept in, gray and sluggish, I pulled up the security footage on the ancient monitor in the back. There he was, a grainy figure on the screen, standing motionless for 20 minutes before I'd noticed him, 20 minutes of tapping, staring right at me through the glass. His face was a smudge, unreadable, but those hands pressed against the window burned into my memory. I didn't sleep much that day, replaying it over and over, wondering who he was, what he wanted. The store felt different after that, like it was holding its breath, waiting for him to come back. He never did, at least, not while I was there. But sometimes, when the wind picks up and taps against my window at home, I still feel that knot in my stomach, and I check the locks twice. This one comes from my cousin Sarah, who told me about it over Thanksgiving a few years back. She was 15 in 2009, living in her grandparents' old farmhouse in rural Virginia. The house was a sprawling, creaky thing, with peeling paint and a wraparound porch that groaned under your weight. Sarah's room was on the second floor, right under the attic, and she'd always hated how the trapdoor in her ceiling rattled whenever the wind picked up. One night, she woke up to a soft thumping sound, like something small falling onto the floor above. She figured it was a mouse or maybe some old junk shifting around, so she tried to ignore it and go back to sleep. But the thumping kept coming, steady and slow, moving across the attic like footsteps. She grabbed her phone, texted her older brother Matt, who slept down the hall, and asked if he'd heard it too. He had, and being the brave one, he grabbed a flashlight and a baseball bat, motioning for her to follow him up the narrow pull-down ladder. The attic was a mess of cobwebs and cardboard boxes, the air thick with dust that stung their eyes. They swept the flashlight around, expecting to see a raccoon or a busted pipe. Instead, the beam landed on a porcelain doll, a foot tall, with cracked cheeks and glassy blue eyes, sitting upright in the middle of the floor. Sarah swears it wasn't there the last time they'd been up, months ago, sorting Christmas decorations. Matt laughed it off, saying it must have been propped up by a draft, but as they turned to leave, they heard it, a sharp, deliberate thump. They spun around, and the doll was lying on its side, a good 5 feet from where it had been. No wind, no strings, just the two of them and that thing in the dark. They bolted downstairs, locked the trapdoor, and never went back up. The next summer, their grandparents sold the house, and Sarah still wonders what else was hiding in that attic. My friend Carlos shared this one from his teenage years, back in the summer of 2005. He was 17, lanky and restless, on a camping trip with his dad and uncle in the Adirondacks, a rugged stretch of upstate New York where the wilderness feels endless. They'd pitched their tents near a small lake, a good mile from the nearest trailhead, surrounded by a dense forest of pines and maples that swallowed the sunlight long before dusk. The first night was textbook camping, a crackling fire spitting embers into the starry sky, roasted marshmallows leaving sticky trails on their fingers, and the kind of easy laughter that comes with being out in the wild. Carlos said it felt perfect, until the second night, when everything shifted. It was around 3 a.m. when he woke up, bladder nagging him out of a dream he couldn't quite recall. His tent was zipped tight against the chill, the nylon walls trembling faintly in the still air. Inside, he could hear his dad snoring a few feet away, a steady rumble that usually lulled him back to sleep. He grabbed his flashlight, unzipped the flap, and stepped out into the dark. Right away, he noticed how quiet it was, too quiet. No crickets chirped, no leaves rustled in the breeze, no distant hoots from owls. Just an eerie hush that pressed against his ears and made his skin prickle, like the forest was holding its breath. He shrugged it off, figuring he was just groggy, and shuffled about 20 yards from camp, the beam of his flashlight cutting a thin path through the shadows. That's when he heard it, a whisper, soft and close, like someone was standing right behind him, their breath grazing his neck. Carlos, it said, clear as day, his name hanging in the air. His heart slammed into his ribs as he whipped around, the flashlight trembling in his grip, its light bouncing off tree trunks and underbrush, nothing but shadows and stillness. His pulse thudded in his ears, but he tried to reason it away. Sleep deprivation, maybe, or the wind playing tricks through the branches. Dad? Uncle Rick, he called out, voice cracking slightly. No answer, just the echo of his words fading into the trees. Then it came again, Carlos, this time from the opposite direction, low and insistent, like it was circling him. Panic clawed at his chest, and he bolted back to the tent, tripping over roots, flashlight beam swinging wildly. He shook his dad awake, babbling about voices in the dark, words tumbling out in a rush. His dad, bleary-eyed and grumbling, rolled over in his sleeping bag. "Probably an animal, kid, or your imagination. Go back to sleep," he muttered, already drifting off. Carlos barely slept after that, eyes locked on the tent flap until dawn crept through the trees. When they packed up the next morning, he noticed something odd near his tent, a single footprint pressed into the damp mud, barefoot and human-sized, toes splayed like it had been standing there a while. No tracks led to it or away, just that lone mark, stark against the earth. His dad squinted at it, scratching his beard, but couldn't explain it away. The forest had been untouched otherwise, no signs of anyone passing through. They broke camp in silence, the weight of that footprint lingering, and Carlos says they never went back to that spot again. This happened to my co-worker Jenna back in 2018. She was 28, living alone in a cramped duplex on a quiet street in Seattle, pulling late shifts at the same convenience store where I worked. One rainy night in October, she got home around 1 a.m., exhausted from a shift that dragged on forever. She tossed her keys onto the counter, they clattered against the chipped formica, and kicked off her soggy sneakers. The kitchen smelled faintly of damp cardboard as she popped some leftovers into the microwave, the hum filling the silence. Her phone buzzed on the counter, a sharp vibration that made her jump. It was an unknown number, no caller ID. She ignored it, figuring it was just another robocall about car warranties, but it rang again. And again. By the fourth call, curiosity outweighed her annoyance, and she swiped to answer, pressing the phone to her ear. Silence at first, just a faint static crackle, then a man's voice, low, raspy, like gravel scraping together, "You're home late tonight." Her blood ran cold, a shiver racing down her spine. Her mouth went dry as she stammered, "Who is this?" But the line clicked dead, leaving only the dial tone's hollow whine. Heart pounding, she darted to the door, double-checking the locks, then yanked the blinds aside to scan the street. Nothing, just wet pavement glistening under the streetlights, shadows pooling around parked cars. She tried to shake it off, but 5 minutes later, the phone rang again, same number. Her hands trembled as she answered. "I like the red shirt you're wearing," the voice said, slow and deliberate. She was still in her red flannel from work, the damp fabric clinging to her shoulders. Panic surged through her, a wave of nausea twisting her gut. She hung up, dialed 911 with shaky fingers, and grabbed a kitchen knife, its blade glinting under the fluorescent light. She locked herself in the bathroom, crouching by the tub, clutching the knife as she whispered her address to the operator. The cops arrived 20 minutes later, their flashlight beams slicing through the dark as they searched the duplex. Nothing, no one. But her call log showed the number traced to a payphone 2 blocks away, rusted and out of service for years. Jenna moved out a month later, crashing with a friend until she found a new place. She still won't answer unknown calls, says the sound of a ringtone makes her stomach drop every time. My Uncle Pete told me this one from way back in 1999, when I was just a kid and he was 35, fresh off a messy divorce. He'd moved into a cramped rental house on the edge of a small Texas town, a single-story box with faded siding and a sagging roof. Inside, a long hallway ran like a spine from the bedrooms to the living room, its hardwood floors so worn every step echoed, sharp and hollow. One humid night in July, Pete was up late, sprawled on a lumpy couch, watching some old western on TV. The house was dark except for the flickering blue glow of the screen, casting jittery shadows across the walls. Around midnight, a faint creak broke through the drone of gunfire on the show. He grabbed the remote, muted it, and sat up, ears straining. Another creak, slow, deliberate, like someone placing their weight carefully on the floorboards, step by step, coming toward him from the hallway. He called out, "Hello?" his voice rough from disuse, half hoping it was a neighbor who'd wandered in by mistake, maybe old Mrs. Carter from next door, confused again. No response, just more creaks, closer now, steady and unhurried. His pulse quickened as he slid off the couch, grabbing a golf club from the closet by the TV, its grip slick with sweat in his palm. He stepped into the hall, the air thick and still. At the far end, beneath the faint green blink of a smoke detector, stood a shadow, tall, featureless, a silhouette too solid to be a trick of the light or a coat rack playing games with his eyes. It didn't move, just loomed there, silent, a void against the peeling wallpaper. Pete's hands shook as he raised the club, his voice cracking, "Get out." The shadow tilted its head, a slow, curious motion, then slid backward, melting into the wall like ink soaking into paper, leaving nothing behind. He stumbled forward, flipping on every light switch he could reach, the bulbs buzzing to life. He searched every room, bedrooms, bathroom, even the tiny pantry, nothing. No open doors, no broken windows, just the stale smell of dust and his own ragged breathing. He slept with the lights on for weeks after that, the golf club propped by his bed, jumping at every creak the house threw at him. When the lease ran out, he packed up and left, never looking back. This one's from my neighbor Lisa, who lived just down the street from me back in 2020. She was 40, a single mom raising 2 kids, a 6-year-old boy and a 9-year-old girl, in a cozy little bungalow tucked into our quiet Portland suburb. The house was small but warm, with cedar siding and a sloped roof that always seemed to catch the snow just right. It was mid-December, a week before Christmas, and Lisa was up late in the living room, surrounded by rolls of wrapping paper, ribbons, and a tangle of Scotch tape. The kids were asleep upstairs, their soft breathing drifting down through the ceiling. The only sounds were the crinkle of paper and the faint hum of the radiator kicking on against the winter chill. Around midnight, a knock shattered the stillness, 3 sharp raps on the front door, loud enough to make her jump, scissors clattering to the coffee table. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the neighborhood was dead quiet, blanketed in a fresh layer of snow that glowed faintly under the streetlights. Lisa brushed it off as nothing, a delivery guy with the wrong address, maybe, and crept to the door, her socked feet silent on the hardwood. She pressed her eye to the peephole, squinting into the cold night. Nobody there, just the porch light casting long, jagged shadows across the drift-covered steps, the snow untouched and pristine. She figured it was a prank, some bored teens messing around in the dark, and shook her head, returning to her pile of half-wrapped toys. 5 minutes later, it happened again, 3 knocks, harder this time, rattling the doorframe. Her stomach tightened as she checked again, peephole cold against her skin, still nothing, just the empty porch and the wind whispering through the bare trees. Her dog, a scrappy little terrier named Max, perked up from his spot by the couch, ears twitching. He let out a low growl, deep in his throat, his eyes locked on the door, hackles rising. Lisa tried to laugh it off, muttering to Max that it was just the wind, but the third time the knock came, sharp, insistent, she froze. Her hands hovered over a gift box as Max's growl turned into a snarl. Then she heard it, not a knock, but a voice, muffled and faint, seeping through the door like a draft, "Let me in, Lisa." Her name, spoken slow and deliberate, hung in the air. Her breath caught, a chill racing down her spine. She dropped her phone, the screen cracking against the floor, and scooped up Max, his wiry body trembling against her chest. She didn't think, just ran, bolting upstairs 2 steps at a time, her heart hammering. She darted into the kids' room, easing the door shut behind her, and shoved a dresser against it, the wood scraping loudly in the silence. The kids stirred but didn't wake, their little faces peaceful under the glow of a nightlight. "This last one's mine again, from last year, 2024. I just moved into a new place, a ground-floor apartment in a brick building with big windows overlooking a courtyard dotted with leafless trees. It was late March, and I was still settling in, boxes stacked in corners. One night, around 1 a.m., I was brushing my teeth, the bathroom light buzzing harsh against the cracked white tiles. The mirror above the sink was old, its edges speckled with dark age spots, but it did the job, barely. I leaned in, rinsing the minty foam from my mouth, when I glanced up and saw it, a face behind me in the reflection, pale and blurry, hovering just over my left shoulder. My stomach dropped. I spun around, toothpaste dripping down my chin onto the floor, nobody there, just the open bathroom door framing the dark living room beyond, silent and still. My heart slammed against my ribs as I whipped back to the mirror. The face was gone, but the glass looked wrong, like it was rippling faintly, a shimmer in the dim light. I flicked off the switch, the room plunging into shadow, and bolted to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. Exhaustion, I muttered, pacing, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the mind, too many late nights unpacking. But the next night, it happened again. Same spot, same pale face, only this time it smiled, a thin, crooked grin that didn't reach its hollow eyes. I stumbled back, breath hitching, and avoided that bathroom for days, brushing my teeth over the kitchen sink instead. When I finally mustered the courage to check again, the mirror looked normal, no ripples, no face, but I found a small, scratched mark on the wooden frame, 3 jagged lines, like fingernails clawing at it. I don't know what it was, but I've taped a towel over that mirror, its edges curling from the damp. It's staying there. These stories stick with you, don't they? They creep into your thoughts when the house goes quiet or the shadows stretch too long. I've seen some weird stuff, and hearing from others just makes me wonder what's out there, lurking in the dark. If you're new here, hit subscribe and ring the bell, there's more coming. Share these with your friends if you dare, and drop your thoughts below. Stay safe, you never know what's watching.